In the Shadow of Persecution, a podcast of Jewish and other wisdom for our spiritual survival. If you're here, trans or otherwise Jewish, or otherwise, if you are here, you're in the right place. I'm Lexi Kohansky. My email is lexi@thetorahstudio.org, and welcome to Torah for Trans Lives.
למען יזרמך חבוא ולא ידום אדוני אלוהי לעולמותיך היה נה 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 היה 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 היה
A couple of weeks ago, House Republicans took the next logical step in their quest to erase trans people off the face of the earth. You may have heard about it by now, but here is how Erin In the Morning describes it. House spending bill now bans Medicaid for transition care for adults. Here's what she says. Republican leaders made a last-minute concession to the party's hard right flank, expanding a provision banning Medicaid funds for transgender youth to now include all transgender people, regardless of age. The move marks a significant and unprecedented escalation, effectively the first major federal effort to restrict access to transition-related care for adults. It also confirms what many transgender advocates have long warned and what some GOP operatives have candidly admitted. The end game isn't protecting children, it's banning care for everyone. End quote. So Republicans have been building up to this for a number of years now, starting in individual states with bans targeting trans kids, from their participation in sports to their ability to access gender-affirming health care, and even to their ability to be able to live with their parents. And since the election, we've seen them start to do the same kinds of things on the federal level as well. And just like the progression in the states was from targeting trans kids to targeting trans adults, it is the same thing on the federal stage. They started with targeting trans kids, and now they are targeting trans adults. And it only took them a few months to take this step. And it is terrifying. Trans people who are on Medicaid are not going to be able to access their services or have them covered. And people on ACA plans aren't going to be allowed to have their plans cover their care either if this spending bill passes with this clause through the Senate. And we're calling it a healthcare ban because of how many trans people it would prevent from accessing gender-affirming care. But with all of these things, it's very bad, and it's worth being specific about what it is that this law wants to accomplish. So I just want to read you from the Human Rights Campaign's bullet point summary of what this particular provision in the budget is going to do. Here's what they say. The bill forbids the use of federal Medicaid and CHIP funding for medically necessary health care for transgender people of all ages, meaning, as far as I understand, that any Medicaid funds that come from the federal government cannot be spent on gender-affirming care. As far as I understand, that doesn't mean that state funds can't be used to cover gender-affirming care, or city funds. So it's not clear to me that it's a complete ban, but federal funding for Medicaid is a huge proportion of Medicaid's budget, and this would really be devastating. HRC goes on. A second provision would prevent states from offering medically necessary health care to all transgender people through ACA health plans by excluding this care from the definition of, quote, essential health benefits, regardless of age, end quote. So it's not just Medicaid. It is also any plan that you could get through the expansion of healthcare plans under Obamacare. And it sounds to me like if for Medicaid what they're doing is cutting federal funding, for ACA plans what they're doing is saying you actually cannot cover gender-affirming healthcare at all. So that one's even worse. At the time of this recording, we don't know what's going to happen to this bill once it reaches the Senate. But the fact that this bill could come to the Senate at all from the House is terrifying. And whatever it is we are doing to prepare for a world where our health insurance is not going to cover our transition-related care, whatever we're doing for that materially, we also need to think about what we need to do to prepare for that world spiritually. And darlings, I told you on the very first episode of this podcast that our transitions are not only about becoming embodied in a certain way, they are about becoming vessels for the light of the Creator to exist in this world before the eyes of everyone who can see us. It's not just about looking a certain way or having certain parts or any kind of embodiment you could imagine. It's being embodied for the sake of being a home for the presence of God to shine through you. And this is what the Hasidic masters call gashmias versus ruchnias, mere embodiment as opposed to spirituality. And it's my belief that if we transition with our intention fixed on the spirituality of what it is that we are doing, then we can survive any moment where any particular embodiment is not available to us or is denied us. No matter how evil the people are who are denying it to us, no matter how wicked their intentions are, we can always make it through because we know that the embodiment is not the goal. The embodiment may be the means, one way of accomplishing it. But it is not the end, and it is not the entire purpose, and it is not the whole of what it means to be trans. And in the second episode, we started talking about the Mishkan, the Tabernacle, that the Israelites built to be a home for God in the wilderness, and that God's presence chose to dwell in. And that's a kind of embodiment for God. Today, I want us to think a little more deeply about what it means to build a home for God and what the tension is between the need to have some kind of embodiment so that our genders can be in some sense real and graspable and present in the world, the need for embodied transition versus the need for our transitions to bring a certain kind of spiritual energy into our own lives and into the world. It's so that our souls can show up in a world that doesn't fully hold them, and so that we can do the work that God put us here to do. So I'm going to take us back to the Maor vaShemesh on Parshas Vayakhel. Again, I first learned this source from Rabbi Erin Smokler. And the Maor vaShemesh starts with this midrash about when Hashem asked Moshe to build her a home to live in on the physical world. Here's what the midrash says. It's from Shemos Rabbah 34. B'sha'ah she'amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu leMoshe aseh li mishkan, hischil masmiha. At the moment when the Holy Blessed One said to Moshe, "Make me a tabernacle," Moshe started to be astonished. ואומר, כבודו של הקדוש ברוך הוא מלא עליונים ותחתונים, והוא אומר, עשה לי משכן. And Moshe said, the glory of the Holy Blessed One fills the upper realms and the lower realms. And now she's telling me to build her a tabernacle? Meaning, what do you mean? First of all, God's presence fills the entire universe already. Why does God need me to build her some house to live in? God's already there. And I think also, here's the second point that he says, V'od haya mistakel v'ra'ah sheshlomo omed uvoneh beis hamikdash shehu gadol min hamishkan. And furthermore, Moshe had a vision of Shlomo, of King Solomon, standing and building the Beis Hamikdash, the temple in Jerusalem, which is way bigger and greater than the tabernacle that they had in the desert. V'amar lifnei HaKadosh Baruch Hu, ki ha'omnam yeshev Elokim al ha'aretz. And Shlomo HaMelech, who is building this great big temple, said before the Holy Blessed One, is God really going to dwell in the land? Amar Moshe Uma Beis Hamikdash Yoser Min Mishkan Shlomo Omer Kain. Mishkan alachas kama v'kama. And so Moshe said to Hashem, okay, if this temple, which is way, way more than the Mishkan, Shlomo's saying about it, that like, is God really going to live in this temple? The tabernacle, which is this movable structure made out of leather and dolphin skins and wood, as opposed to the great stones and jewels of the temple, is the tabernacle going to be even better? It's going to be even worse of a home for God. Lachein amar Moshe Yoshev b'seiser alyon. Therefore Moshe said, the psalm, Yoshev b'seiser alyon. Okay, we got to take a step back here. The psalm, the verse in the psalm, which the rabbis understand Moshe to have said, is Yoshev b'seiser alyon b'tzel shaddai yislonan, which traditionally, on the surface, seems to mean something like one who dwells in the secrets of the Most High, the one who takes shelter in the shadow of Shaddai, Shaddai being a name for God, meaning it's just, it seems like Yoshev b'seiser alyon is just a description of a certain kind of person who has a certain kind of relationship with God. But in this midrash, it's understood differently. Moshe is saying Yoshev b'seiser alyon is the Most High who dwells in secrecy and incomprehensibility, really going to be B'tzel Shaddai Yislonan, really going to rest in the shade of Shaddai. Amar Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Simon, Yoshev b'seiser hu elyon al kol briosav. And so Rabbi Yehuda, son of Rabbi Simon, says, the one who dwells in mystery is supreme over all of her creations, meaning God, who dwells in incomprehensible mystery, is way beyond anything that exists in the physical reality. Mahu b'tzel Shaddai. So what does in the shade of Shaddai, again, Shaddai being a name for God, what does in the shade of Shaddai mean? Well, B'tzel El, B'tzel Rachum, B'tzel Chanunin, Kesiv Kan Ela, B'tzel Shaddai, B'tzel Sha'asa, B'tzelel. So the verse in Psalms doesn't say in the shade of God, or in the shade of the merciful one, or in the shade of the other kind of merciful one. It doesn't say any of those things. It says in the shade of Shaddai, meaning in the shade that B'tzelel made. B'tzelel being the artisan who was in charge of doing the physical work of creating the Mishkan, of creating the tabernacle. B'tzelel is the one who actually builds the tabernacle. And Rabbi Yehuda bar Rabbi Simon here is saying, B'tzel Shaddai, in the shade of Shaddai, means in the shade that B'tzelel made, namely the Mishkan. Lachein ne'emar, B'tzel Shaddai yislonan. Therefore it says that she, God, who dwells in the mysteries of everything, is going to rest in the shade of Shaddai. Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu lo kashem she'ata savur kach ani sover. And so the Holy Blessed One says back to Moshe, listen, I don't think the way you do. Eila esrim karesh batzafon ve'esrim badarom ve'shmona b'ma'arav v'lo od eila she'ered va'atzamtzem shechinasi b'sochama al ama. I don't think the way you do. I'm going to have 20 beams in the north and 20 beams in the south, and I'm going to have 8 in the west. And not only that, but I'm going to come down and I'm going to narrow my presence within 1 amma by 1 amma, 1 cubit by 1 cubit. That's going to be enough space for me to dwell in, Moshe. You have no idea what it is that you're talking about. You think I, God, care how nice the house is? You think it matters whether you build a great temple made out of stone that's gonna last hundreds of years, or whether you're gonna build this portable tent that you can take apart and put back together and it's so small? I don't care about the size of the thing. I don't necessarily care what kind of features it has. It doesn't matter, greater or smaller. I dwell in mystery that you can't understand. So you build me this thing that's like only tens of feet big, and I'm gonna dwell in like 1 square cubit of that thing. You don't know what I'm thinking. You don't know what kind of vessel it is that I, the Holy Blessed One, who dwells in mystery, wants to live in. I'm telling you, build me this kind of tabernacle, and I'm going to come down and I'm going to dwell in there. My presence will shine from within it. Now, before we continue with the Maor vaShemesh, I just want to already say a few things about what this midrash is telling us about embodiment and the kind of embodiment that Hashem needs in order to dwell within a vessel. Sometimes when we're just starting our transitions, or even if we're a long way into them, it can be impossible to see how we will ever get to a place where we feel whole with ourselves. You know, we look in the mirror at our bodies and we look at other people's bodies, cis people or other trans people who've been transitioning for a while, and we say, I'm never going to look like that. I'm never going to look as good. I don't think I'm ever going to pass. I don't see how it can happen. And what God says to us in that moment should be the same thing that God says to Moshe. I don't think the way you do. You're looking at yourself, you're comparing yourself to these other things that seem greater, that seem more established, that seem more permanent, or that seem more reliable or more real or more likely to accomplish the goal of the thing you're trying to do. I don't care about that. I don't have the same kind of reasoning that you do. None of that matters to God. That is not the way God reasons. The way God reasons is, build me a vessel and I will dwell in it. Hashem says to Moshe, build me the Mishkan. And then she came down and lived in the Mishkan in as much space as there was available. She said to Shlomo later, build me something a little bigger, build me the temple. And she came down and she filled the temple. And if you are hearing the call to transition, all that matters is you hear the call and you work on building the vessel for God to dwell within you. And let me tell you, before you start, you don't even know how much light you have inside yourself. And as you go on, that little spark of light that called you to make a change, to treat your body as a home that God could dwell in, that a mystery that is incomprehensible and illogical and makes no sense, that a mystery could shine from within, that little spark of light, the more you do, it gets bigger and shines brighter and brighter with more and more strength until hopefully your body is not even something you think about anymore in terms of what you can do to it or how it can change. It is just there holding the presence that shines from within it. And that's what a body is for. Body's not here to look a certain way, to match some model of what you think is the right way it should be, to look like what other women look like, or what other men look like, or what other non-binary people look like. None of those criteria matter to God. She doesn't reason the way we do. Just build the vessel and she will come into it in ways you cannot even imagine. Let's go back to the Maor vaShemesh. He quotes the midrash, and then he says, "V'zeh hamidrash licheora hu sasum v'chasum." This midrash, as it were, seems to be completely incomprehensible. Mahu ha'mashma'us b'tzel Shaddai sheyiyeh mashma b'tzel she'asa b'tzalel. What is the phrase "in the shade of Shaddai" that it should mean in the shade that Betzalel made? Meaning, how are you getting from Shaddai to what Betzalel made? Seems like a random connection. Gam hamidrash shebeparashas Vayakhel deisa kol habina shehaya biVetzalel mishel Shaddai haya gam kein tzarich beor mipnei ma davka mishem Shaddai. And also the midrash that comes on this parsha Vayakhel, where it says all the understanding that was in Betzalel was from Shaddai. Okay, that seems like a connection, but that also requires some explanation. Why Betzalel's understanding that enabled him to build the Mishkan, why was that specifically from the name of God Shaddai, as opposed to some other name? Again, it seems like we're just saying all this stuff comes from Shaddai, but what is Shaddai that it should be the specific name through which vessels are made? We're going to bring another midrash to answer that question. V'amaru Chazal. And here is what the sages said. B'sha'ah shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu es ha'olam hayam rachiv v'holech. In the time when the Holy Blessed One was creating the world, it was expanding and expanding. Kishetei pikios shel shasi, like two threads of yarn. Ad shega'ar bo kadosh baruch hu v'ha'amido, until the Holy Blessed One rebuked it and halted it. V'hainu da'amar Reish Lakish, mai dichsiv ani el shaddai, ani hu she'amarti la'olam dai. And this is what Reish Lakish said. Why is it written, I am, quote, El Shaddai, which is the name of God? It means, I am the one who said to the world, enough. I said enough, die. Ani she amarti la'olam, die. I am Shaddai, meaning I'm the one who said to the world, that's enough. Die meaning enough. So you can hear the name Shaddai, 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 God, Shaddai, that is enough. I'm the one who said to the world, enough, stop expanding, we're done. And just as a side note, this midrash that was written in like 2nd to 5th century Roman occupied Palestine was like, that is describing the actual expansion of the universe from a big bang, and the universe gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until God says, stop expanding, which I guess hasn't happened yet as far as we know, but the universe is still expanding. But it's like, that's actually the structure of the universe. It did start like a wound up ball of yarn, and then something happened and like exploded in a million directions. And it's going and going and going and getting bigger and bigger until God says, stop. ובאור הדבר שראה השם יזברך, שבאים יספשט עוד ויסגשם יוסר, אז לא יהיה ביכולת האדם לחזור ולקשר עצמו בשורשו לאין סוף ברוך הוא. And here's what this midrash means, that the Holy Blessed One saw that if the world expands any more and materializes any further, then it is not going to be in the power of people to come back and connect themselves to their shoresh, to the Infinite One. Okay, this is a very deep idea from the Maor vaShemesh, that the expansion of the universe, there's more and more universe. There's more and more materiality that God is making at the moment of creation. And the more materiality there is, the less spirituality there is. This is the image of tzimtzum, the Kabbalistic concept of contraction, where the world at the beginning is just only spiritual light and energy and flow. And then in order to bring the world into existence, Hashem makes like a little opening in the center of her light and expands it, and expands the opening but retracts the light away to make space for materiality to exist, for stuff that is not spiritual light and flow to exist. And like, we in this world physically are like on the lowest level of that space that exists in the center of the light. In other words, we are inside Hashem's womb, surrounded by pure flow and energy that kind of somehow seeps in and filters through the layers that exist in the space that she opened up for us when she narrowed her light to make materiality possible. But in that sense, the more material a thing is, the harder it is for the spiritual light to get into it. The harder it is for the energy, the harder it is for the flow to come through. And so if the world kept on expanding and getting more and more material, there is, as it were, less and less room for the light to be, less and less possibility for the light to come in until it's entirely material and 0% open to flow. You can think of it, as it were, like, you know, there's life, which is suffused with this energy, and then there's like plastic, which is totally dead and like unchanging and can't like receive any flow from it, and doesn't really give much flow off either. The more and more material a thing is, Maor vaShemesh is saying, the less it's able to receive any kind of ruchnius, any kind of spirituality, any kind of flow or energy. And if the world had kept expanding like the thread of yarn getting stretched thinner and thinner, there would come a point where we would be so material in our existence that we would not be able to turn back, to do tshuva, to return to the Creator who made us, and to connect ourselves to the source of that flow. Because we would be too material. We would be too material. Torah for Trans Lives is made possible in part through the T for Torah Patreon. This podcast, in addition to all my writing, is supported by patrons in honor of Z, Charlotta Adelgond, Elizabeth Marie Wilhelmine, and Rich Siegel. This episode of Torah for Trans Lives is also brought to you by Avraham Strip Mining Company. Avraham Strip Mining Company. You'll never guess which rock this daddy was hewn from. Ve'yikar hakavana haya bivrias ha'olam lios shechinaso b'tachtonim. We've said this before. The point of creating the world was so that God's presence could exist in the lower realms, in our physical universe. Omnam achar kach shekilkelu hadoros es ma'asehem. He's going to go through like a whole history of humanity. However, after the creation of the world, when the generations messed everything up and damaged creation with their acts, Kimodor hamabo v'dor hapalaga, just like the generation of the flood. In the time of Noah, when they were doing such horrible things, God had to send a flood to destroy the world. V'dor hapalaga, and the generation of the dispersal, when they were building the Tower of Babel and trying to ascend to heaven, and God had to intervene and send them apart and give them all sorts of different languages so we couldn't communicate with each other. And by means of their evil acts, the presence of God, the Shekhinah, left. And the revelation of divinity was covered and hidden. And that's kind of how it went. The world was like devoid of the presence of God. We didn't know where it was. We couldn't find it. Maybe Avraham had some of it, etc. And from that time until the giving of the Torah, God's presence did not exist in our physical world. But then, when the Torah was given, Paskazu Hama, the vile corruption, disappeared. The thing that was preventing us from receiving and revealing God's presence, it went away when the Torah was given. And then, at the moment of Mount Sinai, when the 10 commandments were given, then there was the revelation of divinity and the dwelling of the presence in the lower realms. But after that, when they made the golden calf, and this phrase is just heart-wrenching to me, the damage, the spiritual destruction, returned to its normal state. Meaning, it's something here that he thinks like damage and destruction and absence of God's presence is kind of like the default natural setting that the world exists in. And so it's very hard to achieve the goal of creation. And when they made the golden calf, they made this curtain of separation. And then there wasn't any revelation of divinity. And that's why the blessed Hashem commanded us to make the tabernacle with all of its vessels. So that her presence could dwell within it and her divinity could be revealed among them. Just like it says in the verse, and I will dwell among them, among the children of Israel. And with the building of the Mishkan, the intention of the creation of the world that God had in mind from the very beginning would be fulfilled, that her divinity should be revealed in physical reality. That's the story of how we get to the Mishkan. And something that strikes me about this story is we start kind of with the biggest possible thing. God exists in the whole world, and then humans mess it up and mess it up and mess it up until we get to revelation at Sinai, God exists on like a whole mountain, or God's presence exists on a whole mountain, and we mess that up too. And God says, okay, here's the way it's going to work. You're going to build me a vessel. You're going to make a home for me, and then that's something I can dwell in. There's something here I think about God not being able to force her presence on us. And each time that God tries to force herself into what is now our world, it's God's world also, but in a sense, it's ours. It doesn't go well. We rebel. We do bad things. We kick God out. But when God gets us to cooperate, to put our own agency, intention, some part of ourselves in the vessel that God is going to dwell in, that's the kind of vessel that actually can last. And maybe the Mishkan didn't last forever, the temple didn't last forever, but they lasted a pretty long time, and we cared so much about them. And that is kind of the energy from which our whole tradition of wisdom and guidance and divine flow springs. From God's idea to have us participate in the acts of creation and not force her presence on us unilaterally. And as we saw in the midrash, Moshe is like, I don't think that's really gonna work, God. And God is like, listen, just try it out. Try making a vessel that can hold me. Try making a vessel with the goal of my presence being in the world in mind, and we'll just see what happens. And so they do it, and it does happen. And that's why people say that the tabernacle is an example or a parallel of the structure of creation. Because in it, the purpose of creation was fulfilled. And get this, למשוך בו רוחניוס גדול, ולא יסגשם איזה דבר שבבניינו רק שיהיה בגשמיוס כשיעור שיסבול הרוחניוס היותר גדול. When they were building the Mishkan, every single thing they built was with the intention of having the ruchnius, the spiritual flow of divinity and creation inside of it. And so all the vessels that they were building were only exactly as material and made as much as needed to be the minimum to be able to tolerate the greater spirituality that needed to exist in it. Like we saw before, the more embodied something is, the more physical and material it is, the less it's able to receive and give off divine flow. So when they were making the Mishkan, they just had to have that idea in mind. We're not building this vessel so that it can just be a beautiful vessel. And let me tell you, darlings, it was a beautiful vessel. There are dolphin skins. There are curtains woven out of 4 different colors and gold thread. There is like a whole statue of 2 angels facing each other made totally out of gold. A whole gold menorah with lights all the time. There's bread fresh on the table. The smells, the incense. This is not like just a simple box. There's a lot of beauty that goes into this. And with all that said, as amazing and flamboyant and beautiful and gorgeous as the Mishkan was, it was exactly as embodied as it needed to be to contain and tolerate the spiritual flow of God's presence, and no more than that. And like I've been saying, that's the same kind of way we need to treat our vessels when we transition. We're going to be beautiful, flamboyant. We're going to have so much going on. But every single thing we do always has to be with the intention that it should contain an even greater spirituality. And if it's not going to do that, the embodiment is just going to be mere embodiment, mere materiality. It's not going to bring us any closer to God. It's not going to bring us any greater to the real transitions that we need to make in our lives. It's not going to help us survive when things get hard. וכמו שתיקחם הקדוש ברוך הוא את העולם שלא יסרחם ויסגשם אף כחוט השערה. And just like the Holy Blessed One set a limit on the world that it shouldn't expand and materialize further, even one single hair's breadth further than it did. כמו שאמרו, נכנס בו כחוט השערה. Just like they say in another midrash, God entered the 7th day of Shabbos just a hair's breadth. Meaning, God created the seventh day, just the minimum amount so that the seventh day of Shabbos could exist in physical reality, but no more than that, so that it can be as much of a source of ruchnias, of spiritual flow as possible. God made the seventh day just a hair's breadth, physical. Kach hayu tzrichim kavana rabbah b'vinyan hamishkan. And so they needed the same kind of intention, of great intention when they were building the tabernacle. Shelo yiskashem yoser mikashior hatzarich lahamshachas hakedusha afilu kimalo nima. They had to have these great intentions when they were building this vessel for God's presence, that it shouldn't be any more embodied in material except to the measure that was needed in order for the holiness to flow through it, not even one hair's breadth more than that. Because if the materiality of the thing were even a little more, even just a hair's breadth more, then the whole point of the Mishkan wouldn't work out. And that's why it is an example of the works of creation, because it was made the same way God made the world in order to be a vessel for God, meaning exactly as materialized as it needed to be for God to be able to exist in it, and no more than that. So when we build a vessel for God, when we transition to make our bodies into vessels for God, from the mere materiality that the world puts on us, when we turn around and root back into our Creator, Yoshev B'Seiser Elyon, who the one who dwells in mysterious unknowability beyond all things, we're trying to root back to that. We need to do it with great intention and with the awareness of what a body is. What's the project of gender transition? It's got to be the same as the project of the works of creation, which is to say, the material, the body, only matters exactly as much as it needs to so that it can tolerate the spirituality that is even greater. So that God's presence should be Yislonan Betzel Shaddai, so that God's presence should be able to dwell in the shade of what is enough, and no more than that. And so when the arrogant government starts passing bills that prevent us from becoming as embodied as we had hoped to be, as embodied as we imagined we needed to be, embodied enough that we could form ourselves into the image of things that people would be able to understand. Can I trust that someone's going to look at me and see a woman? Maybe not if I don't change my body enough, if I don't change the way I show up, if I don't change my materiality enough. Are people going to get it? Am I going to be safe? Am I going to be able to live the life that I want to live just with even basic human dignity? These questions are real and they matter. And they're about materiality. And while those things matter so much to our lives, to our ability to respect ourselves and each other, to our capacity to just show up and live in a world that hates us, as much as those things matter, we can't ever let them matter more than the spirituality. Haruchnias yoser gadol. The spirituality has to be greater than the materiality. And the body only matters as much as it can tolerate the spiritual energy, as much as it can tolerate the spiritual energy. In other words, transition's not easy. And being a vessel for the divine flow of light that created the universe isn't always a pleasant experience. Transitioning is hard, even when we're actually able to do it to the fullest extent, maybe even all the more so. The more light we have, the more painful it can be to be in a body that ultimately will never be able to match up to it. And so if we are lucky enough to merit starting hormones or having a gender-affirming surgery, to change our voice or our pronouns or get a document updated, even if these things are still possible, there can be this big letdown afterwards. If when we were doing it, we had the kavana, we had the intention more towards the gashmias than the ruchnias. If our intention was more about the embodiment of it, the mere embodiment of it, than the spiritual energy that we want to come through it. I don't get my passport changed or take hormones or speak in the voice that I speak in just so that I can do those things themselves. They're not the end. They're not the point. The point is to be a vessel for God's presence. The Mishkan was built and it took actually 8 days for God's presence to dwell in it. It wasn't immediate. And then even when God's presence did dwell in it, we had to work every single day to keep God's presence there with the sacrifices, with showing up, with our full selves, with bringing our offerings, with giving our lives to the maintenance and protection of this thing that could keep God's presence in it, so that God's presence should be in it. It was never about the Mishkan itself. The Mishkan itself doesn't exist anymore. The temple's been destroyed. The second temple's been destroyed. And yet we can still build vessels for God's presence. We can still be embodied in a way that keeps the spirituality greater. But of course, something behind all of this is, what if it's not enough? What would the Israelites in the desert have done if they didn't have any acacia wood or any gold or any dolphin skins to be able to build the tabernacle? Would it have worked? Would God's presence have still showed up if they couldn't have embodied God's plan as much as God asked them to? Or maybe, would God have been happy with anything that they were able to do? They didn't have dolphin skins, so okay, no dolphin skins. God's still going to show up in the tabernacle, and maybe God's not even going to ask for dolphin skins because she knows we don't have any. Is it that we need to be a certain way and reach a specific point, and then that's enough for us to be able to tolerate the flow that is going to arrive? Or is it that we just need to build whatever it is we can build with great and powerful intentions, and whatever it is we can do, that's what's going to be enough for the ruchnias to dwell within the vessel we're making? The truth is, I don't know. I don't know if not enough embodiment is enough. We're certainly not going to be satisfied with it. It's certainly not going to be a good time if we're not allowed or able to be as embodied as we want, as God is telling us we need to be. But I do know, like I said in the first episode, generations of trans people have lived lives of holiness, lives of sacred service, lives of being vessels for God's presence without things like bottom surgery, without things like bioidentical hormones, and without things like documents showing the name and pronouns that they have chosen. They lived those lives. And they were maybe not able to say it was enough from inside of it, but we can look back and say that was enough to keep us going. Maybe the Mishkan in your lifetime wasn't able to be completed, but it was enough that the world kept on existing with ruchnias in it. We don't let it become a totally material universe, an entirely plastic universe that's like sealed in the trash can of the world. We don't let that happen. And maybe that can be something that we say is enough. In other words, the universe wants to unravel like two threads into nothingness and into death. That is like the natural order of the universe. That is Chazar Hakilkul Le'isano, the damage returned to its default state. The universe wants to unravel. And we, as living beings, as trans people who are connected to the one who dwells in the mysterious incomprehensible, we declare we are alive, vessels full of spirit, a spirit that outstrips the bodies that we're in. No matter how far we are in our transitions, our spirit always outstrips the body we're in, and that is what it means to be alive. So meds or not, surgeries or not, whatever kind of transition we can do or not, that's our mission. The mission of a trans life is to live bursting with great and powerful intentions that shatter open what it can mean to be embodied. That's a trans life. And that's my Torah about it. Torah for Trans Lives is a Torah Studio podcast, written, produced, and performed by Lexi Kohansky. Our volunteer editor is Liz Cardy. Our graphic is Rivka and Yitzchak by Rina Yehuda Newman. Our title music is Lechabot et Ha'ahava by Rabbi Noam Lerman. I'm so glad you've listened.